So as always, let's take a few moments to review everything we learned in this section of the course. We began by using JavaScript's built-in map method to generate an array of JSX from an original array of data. And this is actually a very common technique whenever you have some bunch of data gathered in an array and you want to generate a corresponding element or corresponding bit of JSX for every one of those array elements. For example, when you fetch data from an API, which we have not done yet, but will do later in the course, it's typical to receive some amount of records from your backend. And that may be 3 records or 5 records or 10. You may not be able to predict that number in advance, but what you typically want to do is generate something on screen for each one of those elements. And whatever that dynamic number happens to be is the dynamic number of React components, for example, that you may want to render. And that is precisely where the map method becomes really handy, because you can generate that array of elements or components or JSX chunks for whatever is the size of the original array. And React will render that array of JSX sequentially in the UI. And you can generate as many pieces that are needed in order to build up the interface. So whenever you're using the map method in React, it's very important to provide the key prop to the top level element or component that you are returning from the callback function that you pass to the map method. So the prop is literally called key. It's written in line, just like any other prop. And what it must have is a unique value for each iteration, or in other words, for each element from the original array. And typically key is going to be some kind of lightweight data type, like a unique number or a unique string. Many times it's going to be some kind of property that you can take from the element that you are iterating over. So for example, in our case, we had objects with ID properties, and we knew that the values for those ID properties were unique. So that made it a perfect candidate to provide for the key prop. And of course, as we saw, our UI worked just fine without providing key, but it is strongly recommended because it helps the React algorithm figure out which element is which and help it accelerate how it determines what on the screen it needs to be rendered, what needs to be removed, etc. Right now, we had very basic examples where our array stayed constant, but there are other scenarios where elements are removed or added in between other elements. And for all those scenarios, it helps React a lot to have a unique identifier that it can use for each bit of JSX that helps it when figuring out what has changed. Then we also learned about the special children prop. So we know that whenever we use a component and we render both an opening component tag and a closing component tag, the JSX that we write in the middle between the tags becomes the children prop that that component receives. And then in the body of that child component, we can destructure or take in that children prop just like any other prop, but we can render a dynamic injected piece of content somewhere in that child component. And we saw that that helped us solve the problem of accounting for the differences between the burrito card and taco card while keeping the elements that were the same, such as the white card background and the add to order button. It allowed us to have commonality and duplication while still identifying a dynamic chunk of content or a place in the component where we could inject that dynamic bit of content as well. So we can use named props regularly where we write their names automatically in the parent. In the case of children, it is a prop that is automatically generated for you by React. All right, so it's when you want to inject a JSX. And the last bullet here simply talks about when you might want to use props, regular props versus children. So named props are ideal whenever you want to provide data, such as strings, numbers, arrays, objects. The perfect example in our case is a dynamic title for each taco card, right? In that case, the parent can simply provide the name of the taco, or the image was another example. And that was a simple data type, so we could simply put it as a named prop that is passed down. The children prop is ideal when you want the parent to specify JSX. So now you can actually pass down the equivalent of HTML. And that is exactly what allowed us to determine the order of the image versus the title in our taco card and burrito card while still utilizing the same card component in both scenarios. All right. We also talked about creative components, as I call them, which basically mean components that return JSX in a more clever way. So components must always return some bit of JSX, but that JSX can come from a variety of sources, right? So for example, rather than returning one thing, we can return an array of JSX created from something like the map method. And in that way, our component's responsibility may simply be to take an array and generate an array of JSX from it. So in our case, we had an items prop in our food items component, and the component's responsibility was simply to return an array of new JSX from it. And that allows us to keep small components with small responsibilities. And sometimes those responsibilities are more technical or more JavaScript oriented rather than simply focused on the UI, right? So for example, we can simply take a children prop and return it. And that way we're always going to have some JSX. It's going to be whatever the parent gives me between the opening and closing tag. But if we only return the children, that allows a component to be able to have an additional responsibility, like, for example, fetching data or performing some kind of calculation. It sort of becomes like a middle level or an intermediate layer where it just does some additional logic and then simply renders its children. And that allows you to build components that are more equivalent to JavaScript functions. They just have additional responsibilities on the outskirts of the render, and then they bring everything back by simply rendering something at the end of the day. But that can be something like the children, just return props.children, right? And it will accomplish the result. It's just going to render something that we can't predict at the end of the day, but the component's real responsibility is some additional logic outside of that or before that, right? We also saw that we could render dynamic components provided by the parent. We did things like provide objects where the component property was an actual reference to a React component. We also had our food items component accept a component prop for a little while. And we saw how even though that was a dynamic reference to some component that we cannot predict in advance, we were still able to use React to render that component at some point in the child when needed. And we saw how we could simply swap in things like taco card and burrito card very effortlessly in that design as well. Finally, we also reviewed prop types, and we added a whole bunch of prop types throughout our components as we proceeded. We saw, for example, that prop types node is super helpful when you want to declare a type that is a little more flexible and supports a wide variety of options. So prop types node represents anything React can render to the screen, which can be a string, can be a number, can be JSX, can be a component, etc. We also saw that when a prop is an array, we could use prop types.array, but that wasn't the best option because it wasn't as descriptive as we could be. Instead, what we did for our food items component is we declared array of, which allowed us to specify the actual data type of the elements within that array that is flowing in as a prop. And then we saw as well that we can combine that syntax with prop types.shape to indicate the actual object properties on each object within that array that is flowing in. So we use that to designate, for example, our ID, name, image properties, and our component properties for each food item that was flowing in within our items array into our food items component. So we can get really specific and let prop types help us out in figuring out whether our parent component has given us everything we need or whether it has given us the right data in the right shape. And that validation, again, does not run in your editor. It does not run when you are building. It runs when the app is running in your browser. So it's not perfect. And there are ways that we can perform type checking within our app with using something like TypeScript. But if you do not have TypeScript yet and you have a basic JavaScript project, then the prop types library is a nice little intermediate step to have. All right, that's all there was to cover in this lesson. We learned a lot and I hope you had fun, and I will see you in the next section.